The afternoon sun was slowly fading over the quiet town square. People hurried across the cobblestone streets holding coffee cups and shopping bags, each person lost in their own world. Near the edge of the square, beside a small cafe with golden lights in its window, a young woman sat on a low wooden stool. A second-hand keyboard rested on her lap, and beside her feet was a cardboard sign. The words written on it were simple. "Can I play for food?" Most people didn't stop to read it. Some glanced quickly and walked faster, pretending they hadn't seen her. A few threw her a sympathetic smile but kept going. Others whispered under their breath, guessing her story before she could play a single note. She didn't blame them. She knew how people looked at someone sitting on the street with old clothes and a cheap instrument. She had once been one of those people, walking by, never imagining she'd be here one day. A chilly breeze brushed past, lifting a few strands of her hair. She pulled her coat tighter and looked down at the keyboard. The keys were chipped, some yellowed with age. Still, it worked well enough for her to play. It wasn't much, but it was all she had left of the life she once knew. The cafe door opened and a burst of laughter came from inside. A group of young people stepped out holding their phones. They looked at her, then at her sign, and one of them laughed softly. "Play for food? Maybe she means play for attention," another said, loud enough for her to hear. She kept her eyes on the keyboard, pretending their words didn't reach her. But they did. They always did. Her stomach grumbled softly, and she placed her hands on the keys. She had eaten only a slice of bread that morning. Still, hunger wasn't what hurt the most. It was the silence. The kind that surrounded her since her life had fallen apart. The kind that followed her every time people looked away. She pressed a key. The sound was faint at first, then stronger. She closed her eyes, letting her fingers move slowly. The melody that came out was soft, almost like a whisper, carrying pain and beauty at once. The laughter near her faded. One by one, the voices in the street began to quiet down. The people who had ignored her a moment ago started to turn their heads. Something in the way she played held them still. It wasn't a song from the radio or a tune they could hum along to. It was something deeper, something that came from a place words couldn't reach. As she played, memories came rushing back. She could still see her father sitting by the grand piano in their old living room, his hands gliding across the keys with such grace it made her breath catch. He would close his eyes, lost in the rhythm, his fingers moving like they were part of the instrument. She remembered the sound that filled the house, warm, powerful, and alive. That piano had been her world as a child. She used to sit beside him, her small hands trying to copy his movements. He would laugh softly and guide her fingers, saying, "The piano doesn't just need skill, it needs heart. Promise me, if you ever play, you'll always play from here." He would tap her chest lightly, right above her heart. She had promised. That was years ago, before the car crash. Before the hospital, before everything changed. When her father passed away, the world around her fell silent. He had been more than her family. He was her anchor. Music was the language they shared, and without him, every note she played felt empty. Her mother tried to hold things together, but grief has a way of breaking people in quiet ways. She stopped eating, stopped smiling, stopped living. Within a year, her mother was gone too. Her heart simply gave up. By the time the lawyers and courts finished with the estate, there was almost nothing left. The big house, the grand piano, the savings, all gone. What she managed to keep was the old keyboard her father had once used for practice. It wasn't valuable, not to anyone else, but to her, it was everything. She spent nights moving from one friend's couch to another until those offers faded too. People grew distant. Life did that. It kept moving while she was stuck in the past. Eventually, she found herself here, in this small town, where no one knew her name or her father's legacy. The notes continued to flow, and the sound grew stronger. The music seemed to tell a story of loss, of memories, of love that refused to die. A little boy tugged at his mother's sleeve nearby. "Mama, she's really good," he said softly. His mother nodded, her eyes fixed on the girl playing. A man who had been hurrying past stopped too, frowning slightly as if something about the melody felt familiar. Even the group of young people who had mocked her earlier had fallen silent. One of them raised his phone and began to record. The wind carried the tune down the narrow street, through the open cafe door and across the square. The cafe owner stepped outside, wiping his hands on a towel. He had seen street performers before, but something about this girl was different. She wasn't playing for money or attention. She was playing like someone trying to breathe again after being underwater for too long. When she finished, her hands rested on the keys. There was no sound now, only the quiet rustle of the wind. She didn't open her eyes right away. She didn't need to. She could feel the stillness around her, the silence that comes not from indifference, but from awe. Then came the sound she wasn't expecting. Applause. It started with one person, then another, until the whole square seemed to join in. She lifted her head slowly, her eyes glistening under the golden light. A few people approached, leaving coins and small bills in the open case beside her. She smiled faintly, whispering a soft, "Thank you." Among the crowd, the man from the cafe watched quietly. He stepped closer and asked, "Do you come here every day?" She hesitated before nodding. "When I can," she said softly. He looked at her keyboard, noticing how worn out it was. "It's old, but it sounds beautiful," he said. "It belonged to someone very special," she replied, her fingers brushing lightly over the keys. He didn't ask more. There was something in her tone that told him not to. After the crowd began to fade, she packed her keyboard slowly. Her stomach was still empty, but she didn't feel hungry anymore. Something had changed that evening. People had listened, not out of pity, but because they felt something. And that meant more to her than a full meal. As she walked toward the small room she rented on the edge of town, she couldn't stop thinking about the way the music had flowed out of her tonight. It had been years since she played like that, truly played. Maybe her father's words had found their way back to her. When she reached her room, she placed the keyboard gently on the table and sat down. The air was cold and the walls were thin, but it felt peaceful. She thought about the faces she'd seen in the crowd, the man who wiped a tear, the boy who smiled, the people who stayed until the last note. For the first time in a long while, she felt something warm inside her. It wasn't happiness exactly, but it was close. She took out a small photo from her bag. It was faded and creased, showing her as a little girl sitting beside her father at the piano. His eyes were kind, his hands resting on hers. She looked at it for a long moment before whispering, "I kept my promise, Papa. I played from here." She placed her hand over her heart, just like he had taught her. Outside, the town was quiet. The lights of the cafe flickered, and the last few people headed home. In one of the apartments above the square, the man who had recorded her performance uploaded the video online with the title, "Girl Playing Piano for Food, Wait Until You Hear Her." He didn't know who she was, and neither did anyone watching the video that night. But as it began to spread, something stirred in the hearts of people far beyond that small town. Somewhere out there, the world was about to discover that the girl sitting on the cold pavement wasn't just another street performer. She was someone whose music carried a story that had only just begun. The morning after her street performance, the town square was calm again. The chairs outside the cafe were stacked neatly, and the smell of fresh coffee filled the air. The young woman sat at the same spot as the day before, her keyboard balanced on her knees. She didn't know that the video of her playing had already begun spreading online overnight. She only knew one thing. She needed to play again. The night before, she hadn't been able to sleep. The melody she played still echoed in her mind, and every time she closed her eyes, she could see her father smiling faintly beside the old piano. It had been years since she had felt that close to him. A few people recognized her when she arrived. One woman from the cafe smiled and brought her a cup of warm tea. "You played beautifully yesterday," she said kindly. "My daughter couldn't stop talking about it." The young woman thanked her softly, her fingers brushing the edge of the cup. She didn't say much, she rarely did, but there was a quiet warmth in her eyes that spoke more than words could. She began to play again. The same haunting calm filled the air. The melody wasn't cheerful, but it was comforting, like sunlight sneaking through dark clouds. The crowd gathered slowly. There weren't many people yet, just a few who passed by on their way to work. Then an older man stopped across the street. He was tall, his gray hair neatly combed, and he carried a small notebook in his hand. He stood still, listening, his expression thoughtful. Something in the way she played tugged at him. A memory, distant yet familiar. He waited until she finished and the small crowd began to clap again. Then he walked closer, careful not to startle her. "You have a gift," he said softly. "Where did you learn to play like that?" She hesitated, her eyes fixed on the keys. "At home," she answered simply. He smiled gently. "And who was your teacher?" She paused again, her fingers tracing a small scratch on the keyboard. "Someone who loved the piano more than anything," she said. The man nodded slowly, studying her face. He noticed the way her hands moved, the precision in every motion. It reminded him of someone he hadn't thought of in years. He didn't press further. Instead, he took out a small card and placed it beside her cup. "My name's Richard. I used to teach music at the conservatory nearby. If you ever need help, lessons, a piano, anything, you can come by." She looked at the card, then at him. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. When he left, she slipped the card into her coat pocket without another word. That evening, she returned to her small rented room, the one with thin walls and a window that looked out at the narrow street. She sat at her table, pulled out the old photo of her father again, and sighed. "You'd probably laugh if you saw me now," she whispered. "Playing on a broken keyboard in a cafe corner." She smiled faintly, though her eyes watered. She didn't know yet that the world was starting to talk about her. The video from the night before had been shared by a few people, then by a local newspaper page, and soon music lovers everywhere began watching it. The clip showed her sitting quietly on the cold pavement, her hands moving across the keys with emotion that didn't need words. The comments under the video were full of surprise and admiration. "Who is she? You can feel the pain in her music. She plays like one of those old masters. Someone needs to find her." By the next morning, it had reached thousands of views. Meanwhile, she had no idea. She spent her morning walking to a nearby market, buying a small loaf of bread and a few apples with the coins she earned. She never thought of fame. She was just grateful she could earn enough to eat. When she returned to her usual spot that afternoon, more people were already there. Not a crowd, but more than before. Some of them held their phones, waiting for her to start. She looked around nervously. She wasn't used to being watched so closely. Still, she placed her fingers on the keys and began to play. The same soft sound filled the square again, but this time there was something different. The air itself felt heavier, like the town was holding its breath. She played one of her father's old pieces, one that he had written but never performed in public. It was a song he used to hum late at night, one that had no name. She remembered sitting on the stairs as a little girl, watching him play it over and over until he fell asleep at the piano. Now, as she played it again, every note carried his memory. The crowd grew. A few people whispered among themselves, "That tune. I've heard it before," said one man, his brow furrowed. Another nodded, recognizing the faint trace of a famous pianist's style, the late Leonard Grayson. When the song ended, silence lingered for a few moments. Then came the applause, and louder than ever before. She smiled shyly, nodding her thanks. Among the people clapping, Richard stood quietly, his heart beating faster. He had spent years teaching music, and he knew talent when he saw it. But what moved him wasn't just her skill, it was her soul. Her playing carried something that couldn't be taught, something that reminded him deeply of his old friend, Leonard Grayson, the same man he had once taught alongside decades ago. After the crowd left, he approached her again. "You remind me of someone," he said softly. "A man I once knew long ago. He played just like you, same touch, same heart." She looked up curiously. "Who?" "Leonard Grayson," he said, her fingers froze. For a second, she didn't breathe. She looked away, pretending to adjust her keyboard. "I've heard of him," she said finally. Richard smiled faintly. "Of course you have. Most pianists have. He was one of a kind." His eyes softened. "You play like him," she didn't reply. But her hands trembled slightly as she packed up her things. She didn't want to talk about it, not yet. That night she couldn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her heart pounding with thoughts she couldn't quiet. It had been years since anyone said her father's name aloud to her. Hearing it again brought everything back. The laughter, the lessons, the accident, the silence that followed. She rose quietly, set up her keyboard, and began to play in the dark. The music was slow, almost like a whisper to herself. Across town, Richard sat at his desk watching the same video that had gone viral. When he saw her face clearly, his suspicion grew stronger. He recognized the engraved initials on the corner of her keyboard, LG. He remembered it well. It was the same old keyboard Leonard had once used while teaching at the conservatory. He leaned back in his chair and sighed. "So it's true," he murmured. "You really are his daughter." The next morning, he returned to the square. She was already there, setting up quietly. He didn't want to overwhelm her, but he also didn't want her to keep hiding. He waited until she finished her first piece, then walked up slowly. "You don't have to pretend anymore," he said gently. "I know who you are." She froze, her eyes meeting his. "You're mistaken," she whispered. "No," he said softly. "That keyboard belonged to your father. I remember when he bought it. You're his daughter, aren't you?" Tears welled up in her eyes, but she turned away. "Please," she said, her voice shaking. "I just want to play." "That's all," he nodded, understanding. "All right," he said kindly. "Play. But remember, hiding won't protect you forever. The world will find out soon." She didn't answer. She simply placed her fingers back on the keys and began to play again, pouring her emotions into every note. The crowd gathered, bigger than ever before. Some people recognized her from the video online. Cameras flashed and whispers spread through the air. But she didn't look up. She played as if the world around her didn't exist. When she finished, applause thundered through the square. She stood up slowly, her hands trembling, her heart full of both fear and relief. That night, as she walked home under the dim streetlights, she realized something. Her secret was no longer safe. People would soon know who she was, and there would be no going back. But deep inside, a quiet voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new, not the end. She looked up at the stars and whispered softly, "Maybe it's time, Papa. Maybe it's time the world heard your music again." The morning after the crowd gathered to hear her play, the town square felt different. There was a strange kind of energy in the air. People weren't rushing to work as usual. Some were standing near the cafe, talking quietly, pointing toward the spot where she usually sat with her keyboard. Her story had spread faster than she could imagine. Overnight, newspapers and websites had started writing about the mystery pianist. The video that once had a few thousand views now had millions. Headlines called her the girl who plays for food with the soul of a legend. Others compared her to the late pianist Leonard Grayson, noting how her style and emotion felt uncannily similar. She didn't know any of this when she stepped out of her small room that morning, carrying her worn keyboard in a cloth bag. All she knew was that she needed to play again. Music had always been her way to escape, to breathe, to survive. When she reached the square, she stopped in surprise. There was already a small crowd waiting, far larger than before. Some people held cameras. Some were reporters, and a few had even brought instruments, hoping to play alongside her. The cafe owner smiled when he saw her waving from the door. "You're famous now," he said with a laugh. She frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" He handed her his phone. On the screen was a news post showing her photo, her sign beside the keyboard, and the headline that said, "Unknown street pianist leaves crowd speechless. Her story will break your heart." Her breath caught for a moment. She didn't know whether to feel happy or scared. Richard arrived just then, walking slowly with a calm smile. "You've been found," he said softly. "The world knows your face now." She looked down at the ground. "I didn't want this," she whispered. "I only wanted to play." "I know," Richard said gently. "But maybe it's time people hear the truth and who you really are." She didn't answer. Her hands trembled slightly as she unpacked her keyboard. The crowd moved closer, eager to hear her again. She took a deep breath and pressed the first key. The sound was soft, almost fragile, but within seconds the melody filled the square again. Every note carried a piece of her heart. She played one of her father's old pieces, the same one she used to listen to from the stairs as a little girl. The people listening didn't just hear music. They felt something they couldn't quite explain, as if they were hearing the story of someone's life, full of pain, loss, and quiet hope. When the song ended, there was silence for a moment, then a wave of applause. Reporters began moving forward, asking questions all at once. "Who taught you to play? Is it true you're related to Leonard Grayson? Why are you performing on the streets?" The noise grew overwhelming. Cameras flashed and microphones were pushed toward her face. She took a small step back, clutching her keyboard like a shield. "Please," she said softly. "I'm not looking for attention." But no one seemed to hear her. Richard stepped in, raising his voice politely. That's enough, he said firmly. Give her space. He guided her away from the crowd through the alley behind the cafe. She was shaking. I didn't want this, she whispered again. I just wanted to play. I know, he said. But you can't hide anymore. They've already connected the dots. You look like him, play like him, even your initials match his. You can't run from who you are. She sat on a step staring at her hands. But if they know, they'll think I'm trying to use his name. I don't want people to see me as his daughter. I want them to hear me, Richard nodded. Then make them. Show them that your music is your own. Use your father's legacy to light your own path. She looked up slowly. How? He smiled faintly. By playing. Not for food this time, but for truth. That night she stayed awake, sitting by the window with her keyboard on her lap. The street outside was quiet, but her mind wasn't. She thought about her father, his laughter, his lessons, his promise that music could heal even the deepest wounds. For years, she had hidden from the world, afraid of what people might say if they knew her last name. But maybe Richard was right. Maybe it was time to stop hiding. The next morning, she agreed to meet with him at the conservatory. The building was old, filled with echoes of the past, of musicians who had once dreamed of greatness. As they walked through the hall, she felt a lump in her throat. She had been here before as a child, holding her father's hand. Richard led her into a large practice room with a grand piano in the center. She ran her hand gently across the smooth black surface. It felt both familiar and foreign. This is where your father and I taught students, Richard said quietly. He would sit right there at that piano. I can still hear him playing sometimes when the halls are quiet. She smiled faintly. He used to bring me here after his classes. He'd play one song before we went home. I thought he was playing just for me. Richard chuckled softly. He probably was. She sat down at the piano, hesitating for a moment. Then she began to play. The sound filled the room, rich and warm, so different from her little street keyboard. It was like breathing again after years underwater. When she finished, Richard clapped softly. You belong on a stage, he said. Not on the street, she shook her head. I don't know if I can do that anymore. You can, he said firmly. And you should. Your music deserves to be heard. Your father would have wanted that. She looked down, her eyes shining with emotion. Do you really think so? I know so, he said. Over the next few days, word about her spread everywhere. News stations wanted interviews, music schools wanted her to perform, and concert organizers offered her spots. But she turned down most of them. She wasn't ready for fame. She just wanted to play in peace. Then one evening, Richard came to her with an idea. What if you performed one concert? He suggested. Not for fame or money and for charity. You could play for children who can't afford music lessons. You'd be helping others just like your father used to. She thought about it quietly for a moment, then nodded. If it helps someone, I'll do it. The concert was set for the following month. It wasn't a grand event, just a small theater with a few hundred seats. But when the announcement went online, tickets sold out in hours. People were eager to see the girl who had once played on the streets for food. On the night of the concert, she stood backstage, her hands trembling. She wore a simple dress and held one of her father's cufflinks pinned to her sleeve, the only thing she had left from him. Richard came over, smiling proudly. Nervous? A little, she admitted. He chuckled. Good, that means you care. When she stepped onto the stage, the room went silent. The lights were soft, the audience waiting. She sat down, took a deep breath, and began to play. Her first song was one of her own, something she had written in her loneliest days when the world had turned its back on her. The notes rose gently, then grew stronger, wrapping the audience in emotion. People leaned forward, drawn in. Her second song was her father's unfinished piece, the one she had once played in the streets. As the melody unfolded, many in the crowd began to recognize it. Tears glistened in a few eyes. By the time she finished, the theater was completely silent. Then came a wave of applause louder than anything she had ever heard before. She stood, tears slipping down her cheeks. She didn't say much, just a quiet thank you. But the audience understood. That night, as she stepped outside into the cool air, Richard handed her a small envelope. From the concert, he said. Donations. Enough to start something new. She opened it slowly. Inside was a note that read, For those who play from the heart. She smiled, realizing what it meant. She could use this to help others, children who dreamed of music but had no means. For the first time in years, she didn't feel lost. She felt purpose. As she walked home under the stars, she whispered softly, "I did it, Papa, your music lives on." The night after the concert, she could hardly sleep. The cheers, the applause, and the warmth of that crowd still echoed in her ears. It had been years since she'd felt that alive. Not because of fame or attention, but because for the first time in so long she had played without fear. She had played for something bigger than herself. The next morning, sunlight streamed softly through the window of her small room. She sat at the table with her keyboard in front of her, the same one she used to carry through the streets. Her hands hovered above the keys, and a small smile formed on her face. The concert had raised enough money to help dozens of children begin music lessons, but she wasn't thinking about that yet. She was thinking about what came next, what her music could still do. There was a gentle knock on the door. When she opened it, Richard stood there holding a newspaper. His eyes were bright with pride. "You should see this," he said. On the front page was her picture, sitting at the grand piano, her eyes closed in deep concentration. The headline read, "From street corners to stages, the girl who brought music back to life." She stared at it for a long moment, her throat tightening. "It doesn't feel real," she said softly. Richard smiled. "It's as real as it gets. You've reminded people what true music feels like." She set the paper down and looked out the window. "I never wanted fame," she murmured. "I just wanted to play, to make people feel something again." "And you did," he said gently. "Now they want to hear more." Over the next few weeks, letters began arriving, not just from fans, but from people whose lives she had unknowingly touched. A mother wrote to thank her for inspiring her son to take up piano again after losing his father. A young woman wrote about how her music helped her through loneliness. A soldier sent a note saying her melody had reminded him what peace felt like. Each letter was filled with gratitude, and each one made her cry a little. She realized then that music had the power to reach people in ways words never could. One afternoon, as she sat in the town square again, just like before, a small boy approached her. He looked about 10, wearing a tattered sweater and carrying a small paper bag. "Are you the lady from the concert?" he asked shyly. She smiled softly. "I guess so." He opened the paper bag and pulled out a sandwich. "My mama said we don't have much, but we wanted to thank you. You helped me get into the new music school." Her heart swelled. She took the sandwich gently, tears forming in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "You don't know how much this means to me." The boy grinned and ran back to his mother, who waved from across the square. She sat there for a moment holding the sandwich, realizing how full her life had become, not with money or fame, but with meaning. Richard joined her later that day carrying a small folder. "I've been thinking," he said, sitting beside her. "What if we start something bigger? A place where street performers, struggling musicians, and children with talent but no means can learn, play, and share their art." She looked at him, intrigued. "A music foundation?" He nodded. "Yes, we could call it something simple. Something that reminds people of where it all started." She thought for a moment, her eyes soft. "Maybe Play for Hope," and Richard smiled. Perfect. The next few months were filled with planning. She used the concert funds to rent a small space near the square, an old workshop with cracked walls and dusty floors. Volunteers came to help clean, paint, and repair the place. Musicians from around town donated instruments. The cafe owner offered free coffee to anyone who helped. It became a community effort, a family of strangers brought together by music. When the doors of Play for Hope finally opened, it wasn't grand or fancy. There were no chandeliers or velvet seats, just a few pianos, some guitars, and a wall filled with photos of people smiling as they played, but it felt alive. Children came after school, laughing and learning. Street performers stopped by to practice, share songs, and even teach others. The room was always filled with sound, imperfect, joyful sound. Sometimes she would sit quietly in the corner watching them. Each time she did, she thought of her father. She wished he could see what his music had inspired. One evening, as the sun began to set, Richard walked in holding a letter. "This came for you," he said. "It's from the city's cultural council." She opened it carefully and began to read. As her eyes moved across the page, her breath caught. "They want me to perform at the National Music Festival," she whispered. Richard grinned. "That's incredible. It's the biggest stage in the country." She hesitated. I don't know if I'm ready for that. It feels too big. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You've played for food, you've played for hope, and now it's time to play for the world. Don't be afraid. She took a deep breath and nodded slowly. All right, she said softly. I'll do it. The weeks leading up to the festival were a blur. Reporters came for interviews, photographers wanted her portraits, and sponsors offered her expensive gowns and jewelry. But she refused most of it. She didn't want to lose the simplicity that made her who she was. On the day of the festival, the grand hall buzzed with excitement. Every seat was taken. Famous musicians, critics, and thousands of viewers watched eagerly. Backstage, she sat quietly, her old keyboard by her side, the same one she had used in the streets. A stage manager looked at her with confusion. Are you really going to use that? He asked. She smiled gently. Yes, it's not perfect, but it's mine. When her name was announced, the audience erupted in applause. She walked onto the stage, carrying the same instrument that once sat on a cold sidewalk. She placed it gently on the stand and sat down. For a moment, she just looked at the crowd, faces she didn't know but who were all waiting for her to play. Then she smiled softly and began. The first notes were quiet, almost fragile. Then they grew stronger, filled with emotion that rippled through the hall. She played her own composition, a piece she had written to tell her story without words. The music moved like a memory, and beginning in sorrow, climbing toward hope and ending in peace. As she played, flashes of her past filled her mind. The hunger, the cold nights, her father's voice. The cafe crowd, the laughter, the kindness of strangers. All of it was in her music. When she played the final note, the hall was silent for a few seconds. Then the applause came, thunderous and long. Some people stood, some wiped tears, others just stared, unable to speak. She bowed her head, her heart full. Later, as she walked backstage, she saw Richard waiting with tears in his eyes. You did it, he said. You didn't just play music tonight, you told your story. She smiled faintly. It's our story, she said. Mine, yours, and everyone who believed in me when I was just a girl on the street. He nodded, unable to speak for a moment. That night, as they left the hall, the city lights shimmered around them. Her life had changed in ways she never could have imagined. Yet deep down she still felt like the same girl who once sat on a cold street corner asking to play for food. But now she wasn't playing for survival. She was playing for hope, for every person who had ever felt invisible, for every child who dreamed, and for the memory of the man whose music had started it all. As they walked through the quiet streets, she whispered softly, Thank you, Papa, for giving me this gift, and for teaching me to play from the heart. The wind carried her words away, but she felt him there, not in the air, not in the stars, but in the music that still lived within her. After the festival performance, her name spread farther than she ever expected. News channels, magazines, and even international music schools reached out. Invitations to perform poured in from all over the world. Yet despite all the glamour and recognition, she still returned to the same quiet place every evening, the small building near the square, the one with chipped paint and warm laughter coming from inside. It was the heart of everything she believed in. Play for hope. The sound of young fingers pressing piano keys, guitars slightly out of tune, and children singing filled the air. It wasn't perfect music, but it was honest. Every note carried a piece of someone's heart, and that made it beautiful. She would walk through the room each day, stopping beside each child, giving them small tips. Don't rush. Feel it, she would say softly. Music is not about speed, it's about emotion. The children adored her. To them, she wasn't a celebrity. She was their teacher, their friend, the woman who listened and understood. One rainy afternoon, while she was helping a young girl with her scales, Richard came rushing in with a grin. You won't believe this, he said, slightly out of breath. A global music charity just offered to fund our program for 3 more years. Her eyes widened. Are you serious? He nodded. Yes. They want us to expand, open branches in other towns. They said what we're doing here could change lives everywhere. For a moment, she couldn't speak. She had started with nothing, just an old keyboard and a dream to bring back her father's spirit through music. Now that dream was growing beyond anything she'd imagined. Over the following months, new centers opened in nearby towns. Each one carried the same warmth. No fancy decorations, no big stages, just space for people to play, learn, and share. She spent her days traveling between centers, meeting children and listening to their stories. Some came from broken homes, some from poverty, and some from families who couldn't afford instruments. But in every face she saw a spark, the same spark she once had. One day, after finishing a long class, she sat by the window watching the rain fall. She could hear the soft sound of a boy practicing in the next room. The tune was slightly off-key but full of emotion. It reminded her of herself, years ago sitting alone and trying to find her place in the world through music. Richard entered quietly. "You've built something special," he said. "You know that, right?" She smiled faintly. "Maybe, but it's not just me. It's everyone who believed that music could heal." He nodded. "Still, you're the reason it began. You've inspired so many." She looked down at her hands. "Sometimes I wonder what my father would say if he could see all this." Richard smiled. "I think he'd be proud. You've carried his legacy further than he ever dreamed." She looked out the window again. He used to say music is not about being heard. It's about making others feel seen. That's what I want this to be. As the days went by, her work became more demanding. There were meetings, concerts, and planning sessions. She barely had time to rest. Her health began to fade slowly, though she didn't pay attention to it at first. She would get tired easily, her hands trembling slightly during long performances. Still, she pushed through. "People are counting on me," she would tell herself. One evening, after finishing a small concert for donors, she felt dizzy and had to sit down backstage. Richard rushed to her side. "You need to take a break," he said firmly. "You can't keep pushing like this." She shook her head weakly. "There's too much to do. The next center opens next week," he sighed. "You won't be able to open anything if you're not well." She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes soft but tired. "You don't understand," she whispered. "Music saved me. Now it's my turn to give that gift back. If I stop even for a while, I'll feel like I'm letting people down." But she knew deep down he was right. Over the next few weeks, she slowed her pace. She spent more time teaching and less time traveling. The students noticed she looked weaker, but her smile never faded. One morning, a young girl named Lily came to her holding a folded piece of paper. "I wrote something for you," she said shyly. She opened it. It was a drawing, a stick figure woman sitting at a piano surrounded by children, all smiling. Above it were the words, "You make the world sound better." Tears welled up in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "This is the most beautiful gift I've ever received." Lily smiled. "When I grow up, I want to teach music too, like you." She hugged the girl gently. "Then promise me one thing," she said softly. "When you teach, don't just show them how to play. Show them why to play." That evening, as she sat by the old piano in her small room, she thought about her journey, from a hungry girl asking to play for food, to the daughter of a legend carrying his name forward, to a teacher who had helped hundreds find their own voices. She smiled faintly, pressing a single key. The sound was soft, almost like a heartbeat. The next week, she received another letter, this time from the National Orchestra. They wanted her to compose a special piece for an international charity concert. It was the biggest opportunity of her life. Richard was thrilled. This could take everything to a new level. He said, "You'll reach millions." But she hesitated. "I'm not sure I have the strength for something that big right now." He placed his hand on hers. "Then don't think of it as a big project. Think of it as one last song, one message from your heart." She nodded slowly. Over the next few months, she poured every bit of herself into that piece. She called it Echoes of Hope. It was a musical journey through her life, from the quiet pain of the streets to the warmth of friendship, the joy of teaching and the peace she had finally found. When the concert day arrived, the grand hall was filled with people from all over the world. Children from her foundation sat in the front row, beaming with pride. As she walked to the piano, the crowd fell silent. She looked out at them, faces full of anticipation, love, and admiration. Then she began to play. The melody rose softly, like a whisper. It carried the weight of her struggles, the laughter of her students, and the memory of her father's voice. Each note told a piece of her story, her fears, her dreams, her pain, and her hope. Halfway through, the orchestra joined in, their instruments blending with her piano like threads in a tapestry. The sound filled the hall, rising higher and higher, until it felt like the entire room was breathing with her. When she reached the final notes, she closed her eyes, feeling the music wrap around her like a warm embrace. The moment she finished, the hall erupted in applause. People stood, cheering, crying, clapping endlessly, but she didn't stand immediately. She stayed seated for a few seconds, her hands resting gently on the keys, tears streaming down her face. In that moment, she knew it wasn't about applause or fame. It was about the journey, about how music had turned her pain into purpose. After the concert, the children ran to her, hugging her tightly. "You were amazing," they shouted. She smiled through her tears. "No," she said softly. "We were amazing, because every time I played, I thought of all of you." Later that night, as she packed her things, Richard found her sitting quietly, staring at the piano. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded. "Yes, for the first time I really am." He smiled. "You know, that piece you played tonight, it wasn't just music. It was your soul." She looked at him with tired but peaceful eyes. "Then maybe my soul can finally rest a little." The moonlight poured through the window, glinting off the piano's surface. She touched it gently and whispered, "Thank you for carrying me through everything." That night she walked home slowly, listening to the sound of distant music coming from the square. Children were playing one of her old melodies, a little off tune, a little messy, but filled with joy. She smiled to herself. That sound, she thought, was all the reward she'd ever need. The morning after her final concert, the city felt quieter. The newspapers once again carried her name, but this time the tone was different. It wasn't about fame or glamour, it was about gratitude. People wrote about how her music had changed lives, how her kindness had inspired a generation, and how her journey reminded everyone that hope could come from the humblest of beginnings. She woke up early, sunlight gently warming her face. For a moment she just sat still, listening to the faint sound of children practicing in the distance. That familiar melody, the one she had written years ago, floated softly through the air. It made her smile. She walked slowly to the window and looked out. The city was alive with music. People were playing in parks, on corners, and in schools. What had once been just her dream was now shared by hundreds, maybe thousands. Later that morning, Richard came by with breakfast and his usual smile. "You're famous again," he said, waving a newspaper. "They're calling last night's concert the performance of a lifetime." She chuckled softly. "Performance of a lifetime," she repeated. "Funny, isn't it? I spent years just trying to play for food." He laughed lightly, but then grew quiet. "You know, I think your father would have been proud. You gave the world something he started." Her eyes softened. "Maybe. But I think he'd remind me it's not about pride. It's about giving. Always giving." They ate quietly for a while. Then she said, almost to herself, "I've been thinking, maybe it's time I step back a little. Let the children, the new teachers, carry this forward." Richard looked surprised. "You'd really stop?" She smiled faintly. "Not stop, just slow down. I want to spend more time with the students, less time with reporters. I want to listen more than I play." He nodded. "That sounds like you." In the following months, she did exactly that. She stopped touring, declined new offers, and focused completely on Play for Hope. Every day she spent time teaching, laughing, and listening. She told her students stories about her early days, about how music had once been her only way to survive. Sometimes they'd ask, "Were you ever scared?" She'd smile and say, "Always. But I learned that fear disappears when you start playing from the heart." She encouraged them to find their own sound, their own story. "Don't copy me," she'd say gently. "The world doesn't need another me. It needs you, your voice, your truth." Slowly, her health continued to weaken, though she never complained. Her hands would tremble more often now, and she grew tired easily. But she still came to the school every morning, even if only to sit and listen. One day, a little boy asked her why her fingers shook. She smiled softly and said, "It's because they've played a lot of songs, and every song leaves a small piece of itself behind." He nodded seriously, as if he understood. One evening, she sat alone in the empty music hall. The lights were dim, and the air smelled faintly of wood and dust. She placed her hands on the piano and began playing a slow tune. It was one her father used to play for her when she was small. Soft, peaceful, and full of love. As the last note faded, she whispered, "I did my best, Papa." Tears filled her eyes, but there was peace in them too. Days turned into weeks, and her students continued to grow. Some of them began performing in small local shows. Others started teaching younger kids. The foundation had become something much bigger than any of them had planned. Then one morning, the children arrived to find the classroom unusually quiet. Richard stood by the window holding his hat in his hands. His eyes were red. "She passed away peacefully last night," he said softly, "in her sleep." For a long time, no one moved. The children sat in silence, trying to understand what that meant. The piano stood in the corner, the sunlight catching on its keys. Then one of the older students walked over and sat at the piano. Her hands trembled slightly as she began to play the song their teacher had written, the one they all knew by heart. One by one, others joined in, humming the melody softly. Soon the whole room was filled with music. Gentle, trembling, beautiful music. Outside, people passing by stopped to listen. Some smiled, some wiped tears. The sound carried out of the open windows and into the square, just like it had in the old days when she first played for strangers. That night, the city square was full of candles. Hundreds of people gathered, children, parents, musicians, and strangers who had once heard her on the street or seen her on stage. They played her songs together, every note a tribute to her life. There were no speeches, no grand ceremonies, and just music. Because that's how she would have wanted it. A few weeks later, Richard and the staff renamed the foundation. Above the entrance, painted in soft gold letters, were the words, "The melody lives on." Underneath, smaller and almost hidden, was another line she had once said, "Play from the heart, and you'll never be forgotten." Years passed. The little school grew into an international movement. New centers opened in cities around the world, each one built on the same belief she had carried her whole life, that music could heal, connect, and change people. Children from every background came to learn. Some were orphans, some refugees, some just kids looking for a place to belong. And when they sat at the piano, the teachers would tell them the same story. There was once a girl who played for food. People laughed at her, not knowing she was the daughter of a piano legend. She had nothing, but she gave everything, and her music fed not just herself, but the hearts of millions. In time, her story became a legend of its own. People spoke of her not as a celebrity, but as a symbol of kindness, a reminder that greatness isn't about fame, but about love. One of her oldest students, now an adult, took over the foundation. He made sure that every child who entered the school learned one simple truth. Music is not a career, it's a language of the soul. On the anniversary of her passing each year, musicians all over the world would gather to play her songs in public squares and small classrooms. Some played perfectly, others clumsily, but all of them played with love. And in those moments, it almost felt like she was there, sitting somewhere nearby, smiling quietly, listening. Years later, one of her students was invited to perform at the same national festival where she had once played. As he sat down at the piano, he placed an old photograph on top of the instrument, a faded picture of her smiling beside her father. When the lights dimmed, he whispered softly, "This is for you," and began to play Echoes of Hope. The audience was silent, hanging on to every note. Some who had seen her perform all those years ago closed their eyes, remembering. Others, hearing it for the first time, were moved to tears. When the final chord faded, the hall stood in applause, and not just for the music, but for the legacy that had never truly ended. Afterward, the young pianist stepped outside. The night air was cool, the stars faint above the city skyline. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear street performers playing her old melodies. He smiled, knowing that her music would never die. Back at the foundation, a small plaque hung in the main room. It showed a quote she had written long ago on a piece of paper now yellowed with age. "When I played for food, I found hunger. When I played for money, I found pressure. But when I played for love, I found life." Every student who read those words understood exactly what she meant, and so her story continued when every song, every lesson, every trembling hand that touched a piano for the first time. She had once been mocked for asking, "Can I play for food?" But in the end, her music had fed hearts across the world, not with bread but with hope.